I'm going to talk about the fight back. Just briefly, I'll say who we are, briefly how we got into this mess here, specifically in the UK, and then I'm going to talk about our campaign, what's going on at sport bodies, and what happens next. We started in 2017 with prisons. That's Dr. Nicola Williams on the right, talking about some of these characters, some of our fellow women, as the ACLU would have it. Then the following year, we mobilised to oppose self-ID in the Gender Recognition Act reform, and we were out on the streets. And this graphic on the left was actually cited as one of the evil things that Maya Frostater took into the workplace, which is apparently terribly distressing for everyone. I'm going to do this really quickly. So we've touched on some of the other stuff. We're trying to make the media not report men's crimes as if they're by women, because that completely distorts the basis. That completely distorts the basis on which we have single-sex spaces, and then people don't understand, and that's why you get these idiots on Twitter saying things like, oh, but women rape too. No, they don't. And you know that we also think data is important, because if we can't record who's male, who's female, we can't plan, we don't have a benchmark for how men and women behave differently and so on. So it's pretty important, and we're one all on lawsuits. It's an expensive business, though. Right, very briefly then, how we got into this mess. So Emma mentioned the UK Sports Council Equality Group, which is all the home nations have got an organisation that does grassroots sports, and then we also have UK Sport, which funds the national teams and picks people for international competition. And in 2013, they got an equality and diversity consultant to talk to some transgender activists about what they wanted in sport rules, and they came up with some rules that were what they wanted. And nobody talked to women about it. They affected the female category, but nobody knew it was happening. And it was basically testosterone suppression. And then, as you know, the IOC came out with something very similar shortly thereafter. And so everyone thought, this is fine, it's a really small problem, but, testosterone is the answer. We then started, as you saw in 2017, and we started to say, what about fairness for females? And it's astonishing that nobody seemed to have thought about that at all. And since then, it's been a fight to be heard and a fight to engage. And we have, you'll see on our website, there's a ton of stuff that shows you kind of us endlessly, at the beginning, mainly talking to ourselves, but over time, starting to get some traction. Putting out material. This is from the US, actually. The examples that were out there came first, but as you now know, there's a lot here in the UK too. We worked with Sharon Davis and wrote to the IOC and had 60 Olympians, male and female, saying, you need to review your rules. That was back in 2019 we did that. Of course, the IOC completely ignored it. Last year, we illustrated, we realised that everyone's concerned about the trans women, but what about the women who are affected? And at the most obvious level, there was a woman who lost her place in her own Olympic team, Olympic event, because of these people. So we really started to get some attention. We put on an event of our own a bit like this 3 years ago, 700 people. Emma was the speaker, and Sharon, and still, we couldn't get any media attention at all. So we could not get people to talk about this. I think they thought it was a bit distasteful. It was just women being a pain. I guess they thought feminism was over, and here it was back. Emma talked about the World Rugby Seminar, so that felt to us like really the first glimmers of hope. And again, Emma spoke. My colleague Nicola Williams spoke. So that was the first major review that said, well, the USA Powerlifting did something the previous year, but this was a world federation. It was held in Twickenham, St Mary's University, and they reviewed the whole thing. Trans speakers, everybody had to have their say, and the conclusion that they drew, which was trans women were getting the benefit of being included in women's events, but female people were bearing the risks. And so on the basis of injury risk alone, safety alone, they were able to declare that they could not, in good conscience, let trans women compete in international teams. But they were only able to do that for international competition because nobody followed. And we were shocked by that. All the home nations for rugby are still grappling with this because they all said, no, nasty transphobes, we're not doing it. And we, nevertheless, we persisted and we kept banging on about, we were lobbying the sports councils, we were lobbying international federations, we were barging into meetings where we could get them. We were at a meeting with World Athletics where they convened a whole bunch of federations. Nicola Williams was the only voice at that this was a meeting in Lausanne. Hers was the only voice speaking up for women, and they tried to say to her that she couldn't call trans women male-bodied. She said, well, how can I even talk about this if I can't say they're male-bodied? But it was all very distasteful. It was very, very hostile. She and I would go to women's sports conferences, kind of incognito, and then one of us would ask the difficult question about, we're talking about women's sport. What do you think will be the impact of trans inclusion in women's sport? And honestly, the temperature in the room would drop 5 degrees and everybody would take a step back away from us. It's very hostile. And we were still pushing to get media coverage. We were looking at legal angles to see what else could be done. Really, it felt at times, I would say, like we were really getting nowhere. But you don't always know when you're wearing down people's boundaries, and you don't always know. People don't admit. They don't say, oh, God, yeah, you were right all along. But change does happen, and I think that's really important for us all to remember. We did then have a second breakthrough. So we thought World Rugby was a big breakthrough. Then finally, the sports councils issued a tender to review that horrible 2013 guidance. And this time, it was a proper process and a proper professional outfit won the work. A sports physician who had worked with Olympic teams and a sports psychologist who'd worked with Olympic teams. And we were overjoyed because these people knew what they were doing. So Emma has mentioned this, the new guidance that came out. It took 18 months. I mean, some of that was political. But it's out there, it's published. It's probably world leading in terms of the rigor that's gone into this. There are multiple documents. They're really worth reading. It talks about, all of the things that we've talked about so far, the performance gap and everything else. And the most significant thing to my mind is the project report, because finally people could speak freely. So we've heard Jane Swim Mom talk about how those girls in the US were gagged. Well, it's the same here. And this is a direct quote from the project report. So it's extraordinary in the world of sports policy to see a report with language like this in it. Frustration, animosity, emotion. There was a lot of swearing, shouting, crying, and anxiety. I mean, sport policy is normally really dry and rigorous, and it's all about rules and details. And here we have all this emotion pouring out, and it's all published by an independent body. So this is a breakthrough for us. And people saying, I'm only going to tell you if it's anonymous. I'd really recommend you go to qualityandsport.com and read it, because it's quite astonishing. And so we took that opportunity to go again at all the sports bodies that we possibly could. I'm not going to go through the actual content of SCEG, because you can, there we go. Because you can go and read this for yourselves, but it's everything you already know. You know that trans inclusion is good, but not in the female category. It's only the female category we're talking about protecting. It's not that we don't want trans people in sport. We just know why we need a female category, and so do you now, after having heard Emma. You know all the stuff. Case by case doesn't work. Testosterone suppression doesn't work. Okay. Most important thing, no more balancing, as Emma said, because that's what we hear all the time, don't we? We want to balance trans inclusion with safety and fairness for women, but balancing means compromising. It means let's give them some inclusion so you can have a bit less fairness and safety. And this report says explicitly you cannot balance these two things. And they said governing bodies now have to choose. Brilliant. So we have been on a new campaign. Here we go. Hang on. We have been on a new campaign. So back in 2019, I emailed every national governing body of every sport in the UK that I could reach. It was like, I don't know, maybe 60 or 80 of them, something like that. Because some of them, they've got individual ones for each of the 4 home nations. And most of them really couldn't even be bothered to answer. It's different now. It does usually take 2 or 3 emails, but nonetheless, the temperature is not quite as frosty towards us as it was back then. And I've been doing that since last autumn and getting, some meetings and making a bit of headway. And then, of course, we know what happened. This happened. And in the UK, there was some cut through and people started to realise that this could happen here. And then, of course, we knew that we were going to get our own Leah Thomas. And that has really shifted gear in the last couple of weeks, hasn't it? And even acknowledgement that women were afraid to speak out. So in the last couple of weeks, it's been amazing to see the shift in tone. I would say that I am still finding governing bodies, some of them really quite hostile. But at least now they can't ignore the issue because they know that they only need one Leah Thomas or one Emily Bridges of their own, and they're going to be in a right mess. So I'm going to spend the last bit of my talk talking about the things they say to me and what we're having to grapple with in terms of why the heck, if everybody knows that men and women are so different, how are they justifying this, and how can we respond to that? So, nobody argues that it's fair. No, I've never heard anyone say it's fine. They have plenty of other reasons why they do it, but not that one. Of course, the first big reason is they say, but sport has to be trans inclusive, to which we say, of course, but not the female category. It's a human rights issue. Actually, sport is not a human right, but whatever human rights trans people have, women have too, don't they? Yeah, but there are only a few. That's really common. We've heard it mentioned before. Emma said it. There are lots of ways you can show this is a rubbish argument, and I think you've heard those very well demonstrated. But the one that strikes me most of all, and that is kind of most shocking, is if this is a tiny number of people, why is everyone prepared to upend the entire system to accommodate them? Yeah. But I think we know the answer to that, don't we? Then some people say, well, trans women are women, legally, so, which again is not true, no matter what Keir Starmer says. It's not true. And we can easily prove that. Then we get a bit of, but wouldn't we be denying their identity if we said, trans women, we're not? And we say, but sport's not about identity. It's about sex. That's what the Equality Act says. You saw that. So no, I don't know about anyone's identity. I'm certainly not denying it. It's about a different thing. They find that kind of difficult, but they know it's true. And especially the people who work in sport know it's true. And then we do get a bit of this, but trans people go through so much and they transition, and I knew Sophie 30 years ago, and blah, blah, all that stuff. That's a slightly tricky one because they think we're not very nice people anyway because we're coming on and criticising. But, of course, people go through all kinds of things. I mean, you heard what Mara went through to get to be an Olympian. So we just try and kind of say yes, but that still doesn't mean that they belong in the women's category. And there are, people make life choices and there are consequences. And those consequences have to be borne by the people who made the choice, not by the rest of us. And women's sport is still relatively fragile. We really can't start bringing in, waifs and strays from other categories. There's more. There's more. We've touched on this one, haven't we? Male-female differences aren't that big, and it's sexist to say so. Very popular with North American students, this one. And students here too. I'm sorry, I'm sure there are some students present. But it's a kind of, progressive, don't talk women down kind of argument. But we know it's rubbish, don't we? It's not sexist to say our bodies are different, and when it comes to sport, you've seen how different. Then you get the kind of, yes, well, at elite level, fair enough, where there's something at stake, but lower down we can be inclusive. Now that's just an admission that it's grossly unfair, but that they still want to find a way of letting the trans women have what they want. And I think, depending on the mindset of the people I'm talking to, they know it's crap, and they just have to find a bit of backbone. Or, they recognise that once you start at elite level, you really can't make the case for justifying it further down. And the talent pathway point that Mara made absolutely applies here. So this is where you're really on a slippery slope, where they're trying to defend something special for a certain group of special people. And we're trying to say, yes, but women, like we're half the population, so we need that consideration too. You do get a bit of, what about case by case? So that's what the RFU are doing now, England Rugby. And of course, that's the most discriminatory thing of all. Can you imagine? Like, some trans women get in and some don't. So like, you're a big bruiser, you don't come in. You're a bit girly, you can play rugby in the women's team. That's clearly not on, is it? And I push that back really hard and say, you can't be discriminatory against individual trans people. And what's more, what kind of pressure is that to put on umpires and referees that they have to pick? You cannot do that. But the mindset of that is a mindset that is, we know they don't belong, but we should try and let some in. They haven't got the courage to just centre female sport and say, do you know what, this is a category for female people. And that's really where we're trying to get back to. We do get a bit of, oh, but women in our sport welcome trans women. Well, great, they can. But you know what, we don't let the people in the sport make the rules. Somebody said to me, he said, you know what, if we let people in rugby still make the rules, they'd all still be punching each other on the field. So, you know, and it's up to us to protect women. I can point to the Skegg report. When people tell me this, I point to the Skegg report that, where it talks about that people were afraid to speak, that women thought they had been threatened with losing their place, with losing their sponsorship. People know full well that even if you like some individuals and you know them and you trust them, it still doesn't mean you can make that decision on behalf of everyone, and it still doesn't make it fair. By and large, when they tell me that it's not a problem and there's only one or two, I say solve this problem before it becomes a problem. And before it becomes personal and you start having to throw people out, because then it's really difficult. You know, and that's where the Emily Bridges thing, and prior to that, Leah Thomas, is so valuable, because they see what a mess they can get into with just one person. And then the last thing is this one. They go, oh, but the chief medical officer signed it off. Or the lawyer said, well, our lawyers have looked at it. Well, yeah, I'm not saying it's illegal. I'm just saying it's unfair. So you, the board of the NGB, make the rules. The lawyer doesn't make the rules. I would say, I mean, I keep having these meetings, and I'm always delighted when someone agrees to meet, because the worst thing is, as they sometimes do, is when they more or less tell you politely to F off. I had one write back to me saying, you know, thank you, we don't need your assistance, and please remove our details from your database. And I wanted to say to him, mate, they're on the internet. Anyway, but when we have good conversations, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And I had one recently, which I think is indicative of how we can win this. So I had one sport where the chief exec was saying, yeah, well, where we've got to, the reason we have this policy is that, you know, I felt a bit guilty, actually, if I can be honest with you. You know, so we sort of thought, when people said, well, can these trans women play in the women's teams? I felt a bit guilty, and I said yes. And so we had the conversation about why that might not be fair on other people. And by the end of the conversation, this chief exec said, I don't feel guilty anymore. And she's ready to make a change in her sport. And I know that she has told other CEOs from other NGBs that, and said, you should talk to these people because it can change how you think about this issue. So you might think it's blindingly obvious, but honestly, their thinking has been formed in such a transcentric way, and our job is to make them think about the female category of sport in a female-centric way, and it can be done. So, my tips for talking about sport, because as we've heard, it is an issue that really does trigger people, because we're not saying anything bad about trans people, we're not questioning their motivation, we're not saying they're predatory, we're not saying anything other than male bodies don't belong in female sport. So is your sport sex affected? So if it's darts, fine. You know, we're not saying it's all sport, but almost every other sport is sex affected. And if it is sex affected, and you know it is because you're running female events separate from male events, then why would we let some males into the female category? On what basis would that even be? Sometimes I think, why are we even having this conversation? You know, there's a lot of stuff about empathy and about passion and acceptance. Someone told me the other day I needed educating. About acceptance. But don't females deserve empathy too? When? I mean, we became the kind of, everybody's mother. But, sports bodies are there to make rules and not to have empathy for certain people and make exceptions. So, one of the things other people have said to me is, but this won't happen in our sport. This is a vanishingly small problem, and they're beginning to see now that actually isn't going to work for them. So one of the things you can say to people is, this already is a big problem. You're just not hearing about it because people aren't allowed to talk about it. The risk is that they think Emily Bridges is the proof that it's, is the exception that proves the rule, the proof that it's very rare because Emily Bridges has been all over the media. But that's because Emily Bridges is threatening our Olympians. Some of our favourite Olympians, like Laura Kenny. No, we know it's happening everywhere, and we're just not allowed to talk about it. And the final thing is, and Emma said this really well, categories in sport have to exclude some people. That's what categories do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any categories, you'd just have sport, and then all the champions would be male. So the final thing that I say to people is, our concern is not trans people. It's the male performance advantage in sport. It's as simple as that. I did have someone tell me the other day that trans women are female, but when I said, okay, but what would you do with the non-binaries? And she really didn't know about that. So, okay, so I'm near the end now. I've been trying really hard to get it into the media that this is not just an elite problem, and the media haven't been that interested. But last Sunday we did have a story out with a number of examples in it, and I think people are beginning to understand there's a story here, which is that so-called trans inclusion is actually a story of female exclusion, and all the reasons why someone can find themselves either being excluded or self-excluding from their own sport. And I think we're finally starting to get that message across. Also, it's not just our problem anymore, is it? Because British cycling have a hell of a problem now, and they are having to deal with it. And, as Emma pointed out to me the other day, the minute they tested their transgender policy that they'd spent all these months crafting, it fell apart. So now that it's a problem that NGB boards are having to deal with, and it's awkward, they're having to engage properly. It's not just about being kind or fair to women now, which is kind of how they've perceived our engagement. It's actually about saving face for themselves. So it's a serious problem now. Of course, you get completely incorrect reporting. So British Cycling have not banned trans riders from racing. They have banned male riders from racing in female competitions. And even if we want to say they've banned transgender women, they've only banned them from the female events. So we got straight back on, but they hadn't corrected it when I looked at it this morning. They said they would. But so, we still have a long way to go, but at least it's out there now. And so what next? Well, we will keep pushing. I think the tide is turning, I really do. And I have more meetings to come. I may be told to educate myself again. Someone told me the other day I was scaremongering. So you have to be, pretty thick-skinned. But I think it's getting better. It's getting easier. More people are speaking up. The media are now interested. Finally, they're interested, which is great. And I would say to you, now we can all talk about it. We all should. And it is a long fight. I've been at this a few years. We all have. But I really now believe that we can win this. Thank you.